Welcome back to the lecture on attention. What happens in the brain when we attend? Now, attention is also referred to as focus and concentration, and it must be rock solid in order to marshal the effort needed to improve your brain's performance. Attention in the mental sphere, in fact, is like endurance in the physical sphere. Like an athlete, you can learn to focus your mental energies. But to do that, you must successfully manage two factors in our current culture: distraction, which is all around us, and multitasking, which we will talk about today in detail. Now, to be fully attentive, first of all, we have to be awake, which is a fairly common sense idea. If we're asleep, we're not attending to anything. When we're awake, it depends on the degree of wakefulness. If we're drowsy, daydreaming, things like that, we're not focused and we're not attending. If we're overly stressed, and we'll talk about stress in a later lecture, we're also not attending well and we can't learn about what's happening around us. We have to be in a narrow continuum, right in the middle of it. And that's where we have highly focused attention, where we'll be able to look at something and get all the details about it. Now, there's also a thing called covert attention, which we're not necessarily even aware that we're attending to. It was Hermann von Helmholtz, who was an early physiologist, who wrote about this. He did an experiment which showed it. In his laboratory, he wrote out some numbers and some figures on a sheet and hung it up at the end of the hall. And then he turned the lights off and then turned them on rapidly to see what he could see on the sheet, and he didn't see anything. But he found out that if he actually voluntarily decided ahead of time what part of the sheet he was going to look at, when the light came on, he was able to tell what those letters or numbers were. So he was able to direct his attention to a particular part of the visual landscape, and at the same time exclude his attention from all the other parts. Now, focusing attention has an effect in the brain. You're changing blood flow patterns, in this case to the visual areas of the brain. So when Dr. Helmholtz was looking at this, he was actually increasing blood flow to the visual part of the brain. It was highly specific. We learn about the world by turning our attention to certain parts of it. There's also a linkage between intention and attention, just as in Helmholtz's experiment. We decide to do something and we devote our attention to it. Now, that can be used as it is in a magic trick, where a magician, for instance, will distract your attention. He'll say, well, look at this. And when you do, the actual magic trick is taking place elsewhere, so that you've been tricked. The audience is directed to intentionally focusing on something that's not important to the trick. Now, if you look at this particular image, it shows you that the upper part of the brain, the attentional network, can control what we're paying our attention to. So just like Helmholtz decided to look at a certain part of that screen. However, we also have sensory input coming from the various senses. If we're stung by a bee, for instance, our attention is directed right there. So it's a dynamism, when you think about it, between focusing our attention from up here, the upper part, the frontal areas particularly, and our attention being produced or captured by events happening around us. Now, there are brain effects of attention. There's enhanced activity in various parts of the brain: the frontal areas, parietal area, the insular cortex, plus an important area called the anterior cingulate. Now, these all comprise a vast attentional network. Now, each has a particular thing that it does. The parietal lobe formulates a dynamic representation. The frontal lobe formulates an action, what's going to be done. And the limbic determines motivation. Now, in this picture, you can see all of these different areas shown. So this is the attentional network that we just talked about. Now, if attention is not being paid, it can be due to damage in the brain. And we'll talk about that first, then we'll move on to normal types of inattention. If you have damage to the right parietal lobe of the brain, which is right up here, then you aren't paying attention to things on the left side. The things that you would see, the things that you would feel, touch, and bodily integration. For instance, a man won't put his left arm into the left sleeve of his shirt because of this inattention to the left side. Now, it's not just all parietal lobe, the opposite parietal lobe is also involved, so right plus left, as well as the frontal lobe to a lesser extent. Now, in this picture, you can see what happens. Someone who is damaged to the right parietal lobe, they're asked to put a dot in the middle of a line, and you can see the dot is moved off to the right because they're not attending to the left side. And the other thing, they're asked to make crosses out of these different figures that are there, and you can see that it's not done on the left side, it's only done on the right. It's also a picture there of a clock, which someone is asked to draw the face of a clock, and they're only able to draw the right side because they've extinguished the left side. Well, as a rule, we don't realize that we're being inattentive. We're talking now, we've moved from people with damage to normal brains. You can think of it as a psychic blind spot. We have a visual blind spot, and that's where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye and goes into the brain. And there's a psychic blind spot as well, things that we don't pay attention to. Road accidents, for instance, occur because of the result of inattentive drivers and or pedestrians. The military has an interesting exercise in which they will suddenly ask a Marine to close his eyes and give a description of what room they're in, where the windows are, how they would escape, where things might happen, and then they open their eyes and they check it out. So this is an example of an attention exercise. All of us are prone to inattention. There's a famous experiment that illustrates this very nicely. It's called Gorillas in Our Midst by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. If you want to try it for yourself, pause the lecture now and look it up in your favorite search engine. The experiment presents you with a video of two basketball teams. There's a team wearing a black jersey and a team wearing a white jersey. While each team passes the ball back and forth, you're instructed to count the number of passes that the white team makes. Now, you know there'll be a trick, so make sure to pay close attention to those players. In the experiment, while you're busy counting, something unexpected is occurring. A gorilla walks across the basketball court directly past the players, and most people are so focused on the ball that they don't notice it at all. Try the experiment again, now that you know the outcome. The gorilla seems obvious now, doesn't it? Now, Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons say that our picture of reality is inherently incomplete. So most of the time we think that we don't realize how much we miss. We think we see more than we do, and that has consequences. If we were aware of our limitations, we wouldn't text and drive or think of anything else that would cause us to have problems in terms of remembering. Attention failures are especially serious in our current culture, dominated by fast response technologies. You're sitting thinking about something and you fire off an email before paying attention to the consequences. Or you reach for your cell phone while you're on the beltway at 70 miles an hour, and during that tenth of a second distraction, you're involved in a fatal accident. Now, if your attention failure is a chronic one, you may be suffering from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Perhaps attention disorder is a consequence of our technologically fast-paced society. It may well be, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. In fact, Elias Abujad, a director of Stanford University's Impulse Disorders Clinic, has this to say about our attention spans. One reason that ADD is on the rise is that our attention span is similar to our attention span on Facebook. Look at language. People are writing the way they text. Anything complex that takes several paragraphs to develop is considered information overload. I think it's regressive, not progressive. It's becoming so normalized in our culture, it's becoming hard to catch it while it's happening. While keeping in mind our brain's intentional or unintentional failures, which under certain circumstances called inattentional blindness, let's return to the positive benefits of learning to focus our attention like a laser. There's 3 attentional control systems in the brain that we have to think about. The first is the alerting system, which is in the frontal lobe and the parietal areas, and uses the neurotransmitter or messenger dopamine as the active messenger. Second is the orienting system, which is frontal and temporal, plus the temporoparietal junction, and that uses acetylcholine as the messenger. And third is an executive system, also the frontal cortex. It also uses dopamine as a messenger. Now, first of all, you have to think about the brain as purpose-driven. A forest, for instance, can inspire a poem, a botany lecture, or a scheme for leveling the trees in the interest of development. Each goal is enhanced by attention, focusing on how to modify current status in order to achieve intended goals. There are benefits from enhanced attention. Improved frontal functioning, IQ improves, sequencing, context, drive, and executive control. We talked about those in the lecture on the frontal lobe. We also have improved conflict resolution by learning what to attend to and what to ignore, because we don't want to attend to everything in our world, everything around us. That's the definition of hyperactivity, attention disorder. We want to actually focus our attention, as we said earlier, like a laser. We want coordination of scattered networks involving sensation, movement, emotions, and language. And any of those things can be the object of our attention. We could be attending to what we're feeling. I gave the example before of being stung by a bee. We could be attending to our movements, how we're feeling, our emotions, and our language. And interestingly, attention has a calming, focusing effect, which you can feel as you try it yourself. It's often described in those even with a tiny bit of ADHD. Now, there are impediments to a sustained attention. You remember the picture we looked at earlier when you went from sleep to alertness? This was an example of what's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, where there's an optimal level of alertness that you should have to be attentive. Too much or too little and you're not attentive. Second impediment is boredom. Third, emotional blunting or burnout. After a while that we've done things over and over, we tend not to be attentive, we're daydreaming. Next is sensory overload, or we're just simply too many things coming on at one time. But the biggest impediment in our culture to sustained attention is multitasking. Now, there are arguments pro and con for multitasking. So let's explore it in a little bit of depth here. First of all, as many people speak of it, multitasking is a myth. We're actually doing things sequentially, not concurrently. We switch from one to the other, but we're not doing them both at the same time. There's what's called an interference effect with the use of the same channel. For instance, I can only listen to so many conversations at one time because one interferes with another. Now, it's sometimes okay if you have separate channels. I can be listening to a conversation and reading something because they're not interfering with one another. If I'm talking on the phone, I can be reading notes, things like that. Now, mental channels can also interfere with physical channels. Not many people realize that. Here's an example. You're driving along in your car and you're on your cell phone, which you shouldn't be for reasons which we'll talk about in a moment, and you're talking to your architect about doing some work in your house. So now you're using the part of your brain, as you're imagining this particular renovation, you're using that same part that you're supposed to be using as you're driving and weaving your way through traffic. There's a bottleneck in the frontal lobe which interferes with us being able to consider two things truly at the same time. It's more that it's sequential. Now, this is the example of cerebral geography. Now, have you ever noticed that when you're trying to make up your mind about three things that's particularly difficult, we're much more comfortable figuring out two things. And there's a reason for that. Difficulties arise when we have three or more. We tend to discard one of them. If we're deciding to go to the beach, the mountains, or New York City, we tend to eliminate one of them and make our decision between the other. Discard one and choose between the other two. The reason for that is that the brain is binary because the medial frontal cortex divides one half into one choice and the other half into the other choice. The medial frontal cortex is part of the brain's motivational system, where rewards are represented. In an experiment, there was matching of an upper and lower case letters. Each side was encoded on one side or the other of the medial frontal cortex. Now, with the introduction of a third factor in this matching test, efficiency dropped precipitously. It was as if each hemisphere was occupied in managing only one task, and there was nowhere for the management of a third task. Bottom line, reduce your decision tree to no more than two alternatives. Binary multitasking is really about all we can handle because of the way our brain is constructed. That's not a weakness, that's the way we are. Now let's talk about the consequences of multitasking. The more people multitask, the worse they do. They become more distractible, and they have problems distinguishing relevant from irrelevant information. Also, problems with mental file keeping, knowing where to put things in conceptual boxes, knowing exactly where they are and you can access them. There's also a loss of organization. They become much more disorganized. This inability to think is also important. That's applying sufficient attention and concentration to develop one's own ideas. Think for oneself. First ideas are often, they seem to be brilliant, but they're usually superficial and derivative. Twitter and tweets and YouTube and so forth provide you with other people's ideas. Raw, unorganized data. To form associations and connections, you have to really work at it. You need time. You need the absence of distraction. You need the absence of multitasking. So slow down. Pay attention in order to think most efficiently and creatively. In a word, ponder. Now, depth, clarity, and cohesion of thought take time and require focused attention. All three are impaired by multitasking. As the novelist and essayist Jay Griffiths has written, skim talking and skim reading promote skim thinking. Thoughts that are summoned at speed are likely to be not the best, but simply the first. I mentioned a moment ago about driving a car and talking on a cell phone, which is definitely not to do because of the interference effect as I described it. Now, David Strayer, who actually did this work and showed that talking on a cell phone actually impairs your ability to drive almost as much as you being intoxicated, actually found that there was a very, very small number of people, 2.5%, who what he calls super taskers. These are people who did just as well doing two things as doing one. And he's written about them. He says, there are super taskers in our midst, rare individuals who, and they're also very intriguing, with extraordinary multitasking ability. For these individuals, multitasking regions may be different. The brain may actually be, if you want to put it this way, organized differently. Now, there's a problem with that finding when you think about it. Everyone, all of us will assume that we are among the 2.5%. Everybody's always above average. I know on examinations and things where I've talked to people in large crowds, I've said, well, how many people think that they're above average in this group? And everybody's hand goes up. Well, that of course creates a problem because if in fact everybody's above average, then what does the term average really mean? Now, let's talk a little bit more about the benefits of attention training and what it does. At the end of the lecture, I'm going to give you ways of focusing your attention and improving it. But now let's talk about the benefits of attention training. Improves concentration, performance in tests of general intelligence. Your EEG or electroencephalogram shows increases in anterior cingulate activity, which correlates with improvements in emotional control. I mentioned a little bit earlier, the anterior cingulate is part of the brain having to do with emotional control. Working memory exercises correlate strongly with attention enhancement. As I've mentioned, working memory, which will be a topic of a whole lecture, is basically doing a little bit of juggling of information in your mind. So you're taking things from your memory and moving it around. Inattention in memory, inattention, of course, is the most common cause of forgetting. When we try to say, why did I forget? We weren't encoding anything. We meet somebody at a party and later we worry that we can't remember their name. We weren't really listening. We didn't encode and therefore we can't retrieve. Now, stress focuses up to a point, but as I mentioned with the Yerkes-Dodson law, if you get too much stress, you can't attend at all. And also, attention varies with interest. We all have various things that we're interested in, and we are very attentive. Even people with ADHD can perform normally if they're interested in the topic. Now, there's short-term memory exercises that I'm going to give you. One of them is called a forward digit span, and this is the first of ones that you can use to improve your own attention. I'm going to tell you what it is in just a second, but I want to tell you what it'll do. It'll help you with math and reading proficiency, enhance performance in attention, concentration, sequencing, and auditory and visual short-term memory. It's also linked with IQ, which of course is the first thing to decrease with aging. There's different encoding for this as well than there is in general memory. So let me talk a bit about the memory techniques that we'll use. First is focus, pay attention. Use as many sensory faculties as you possibly can. And put the information that you have into the form of an image. The starker, the better. The more dramatic, the better. Create and learn a system of memory pegs based on your life experiences. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do that in a special lecture on how to establish a superpower memory. So, relating attention exercises to teaching, we have things like visual sphere, look at pictures rapidly, and then close our eyes and try to describe them, which is a measure not only of our attention but also our memory. We also have auditory, listening, and recalling exactly what we've heard. It's a game called Clap Your Name rather. Let me describe it to you. For auditory attention, where you say your name, let's say your name is Richard, as mine is, and you take the consonants and you slap your thigh, and the vowels, you clap your hand. So it's R-I-C-H-A-R-D. Your name may be Maria, so it would be M-A-R-I-A. Now, you learn to do that, you get this attention to the audition, to the sound of it, and you can play it with somebody else. And of course, you'll be momentarily a little confused because one will interfere with the other, but you're able to do this after some practice. A proprioceptive attention game is the Jenga, which is a game involving a tower of blocks, and you remove one at a time carefully, paying great attention to your hand movements, to your spatial movements without collapsing the whole thing. So this is one of proprioceptive attention. You can also do drawing supplemented by verbal description. You say, well, I'm going to make a drawing of something and supplement that with a verbal description. So these are attention exercises that you can use. Now, improving various components is important because attention is not just one. There's sustained attention, number one, divided, selective attention, and processing speed. Let me talk about each of them separately. Now, sustained and selective attention is something like quickly dictate into a voice recorder a long string of randomly selected letters and numbers. Real quick. And later on, listen to them and tally only the numbers or tally only the letters at the end of the list. This works even better if you get someone else to read it for you. Random letter number lists, and you respond by signaling only when you've heard one or the other. Now, divided attention is attending to two tasks at once. It's a little bit like multitasking, but it's an exercise that you can do. Same period of time, like rapidly tapping your finger while listening and attending to a news story on the radio. Processing speed is another way of attention. Shuffling a deck of cards and breaking the cards into suits from ace to deuce. How fast can you do this? This is an attentional mechanism. Now, music training is really great for attention. Research on music shows that after 15 months, structural changes occur in brain circuits used for music processing. Enhanced music is related to motor and auditory skills. So the better you get, the better motor and auditory skills you have. Now, in some instances, IQ is increased as well. So it's never really too late to take up music. In fact, I'd highly recommend that, whatever your age. Michael Posner, who's a neurologist who's written quite a bit on music and the arts, says that music can change the brain circuitry, improve general cognition, and he thinks it's a key factor in diligence. He says practicing for long periods of time and with sustained effort produces stronger and more efficient attention networks. And these key networks are affecting cognitive skills more generally. Now, I gave you the example a few minutes ago of Clap Your Name, which is a game that strengthens your ability to attend to musical rhythms. So you've actually converted your name into a musical rhythm. It's an interesting experience, as I said, to do it yourself, then with someone else, and then get a group of people together. It's almost like a quartet or something. Each one is listening to the other musician, but they're also playing their particular instrument. Athletics are also important in attention. Combines all sensory spheres, such as golf, tennis, any team or solitary sport is fine. You eventually develop what they call muscle memory, but that's not muscle memory, it's brain memory, the setting up of circuits within the brain, what's sometimes called embodied knowledge, concentrating on areas of weakness, for instance. If you're playing tennis, instead of just doing the same thing again, find out, is it the weakness of the serve that you want to improve? Is that what you want to improve? Well, you have to concentrate on that. But of course, there are ego issues, aren't there? Nobody wants to admit that maybe there's something they're not good at. That's the other side of a professional. Also, they can overcome these sorts of ego issues. Also, there's habit and repetition compulsion. We tend to do the same thing over and over because it's comfortable. We've learned how to do it, so why not just hit the same number of golf balls again and again instead of really focusing on the fact that you have to maybe put some more attention on putting. Now, improved attention, if I can summarize a bit, could lead to cognitive enhancement in multiple areas. And you can easily identify impediments to attention in your own life. Just think, what are the distractions? What keeps you from focusing? Remember I said earlier, there's a certain nice feeling that you get from focusing and paying attention, because the brain really thrives on getting and paying attention. You can train your ability, which is very important, to pay attention. Improvements in sense memory, general memory, and working memory. The arts, sports, everyday living, they all provide opportunities to strengthen attention. For instance, as you're sitting there now, who's sitting beside you? Well, you know who it is, but what exactly are they wearing? Did you pay any attention to it? What color's her dress? What type of a necktie is he wearing? Sometimes we're moving through life and we're not really paying attention to things. We're missing a lot. The aim is to balance attention improvement with multitasking demands. So in summary, attention and memory are highly interrelated. And by enhancing one, you enhance the other. Think of attention as a conduit for sharpening other cognitive skills. Here's a practical tip. When you become inattentive and lose focus, it's time to quit what you're doing. Perhaps take a nap, as we said in Care and Feeding of the Brain. Another practical tip, discover your own personal attention duration. We all vary in that. Our work habits are such. Some writers that I know, they write all day long. Other ones, they can only write 20 minutes at a time. They have to take a break, come back. So it varies quite a bit. Our greatest challenge that we face in our culture, I think, is to enrich our powers of attention while accommodating to our society's increasing demands for multitasking. We don't really have a choice about multitasking. We have to do a little of it, but we don't want it to drive away our attentional powers. Let me just read from what a friend of mine and novelist, Phyllis Thoreau, has written about it. It's a lovely quote, which she states about the powers of attention. Phyllis Thoreau says, "Looking back, I see the idea of attention, pure attention, emerging in different forms and guises. Slowing down long enough to pay full attention requires an empty mind. We must clear the decks and be nothing else. This is what goes counter to the culture, which tries to distract and divide our attention so that it never rests on any one thing for any length of time." In the next lecture, we're going to talk about something that's very clearly related to attention, and that's memory. Because if one can't attend, then you can't obviously encode or remember. So the next lecture will be on how improving your attentional powers can enhance your memory. Thank you.